Post 352, Study Session 7, Politics of India. Introduction. This study session highlights important themes in contemporary India politics, namely, political struggles in a multicultural India, a growing contentiousness among groups, and how India's democracy has managed to pull back, absorb the crisis, and muddle through, albeit with a strained democratic system that is the puzzle of India's democracy. We also discuss the essential elements in Indian politics in order for you to understand both its dynamics in the distribution and exercise and the use of power and the basic character of India's political system. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to recall important themes in contemporary Indian politics. Show how India's democracy has managed to survive in the midst of formidable crises. Analyze the puzzle of India's democracy. Identify the essential elements in Indian politics. Know the basic character of India's political system and describe the dynamics of India's politics. India at crossroads. Referring to events in India on December 6, 1992, the New York Times reported this lead story the next day on its front page. Thousands of Hindus stormed and destroyed an Islamic mosque in the north-central city of India. The impact of the event was chilling, as many recalled the tumult when the modern India state emerged in 1947 amid considerable Hindu-Muslim conflict. The destruction of a mosque thus suggested the possible resurgence of large-scale ethnic violence in the world's most populous democracy. Although the worst outcomes were avoided, this religious conflict was the culmination of a dispute that had been brewing in India for a few years, encouraged by one of India's prominent political parties, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, India's People's Party, or the BJP. The BJP is a religious nationalist party that has been courting the electoral and political support of Hindus, India's largest religious group at over 80% of the country's population. BJP leaders argued that the Islamic mosque at Ayodhya, a place of worship for India's Muslim minority, who constitute nearly 14% of India's population, had been built on the site that the BJP claimed was the birthplace of Hindu god Rama. They wanted to replace the mosque with a Hindu temple. When the national government ruled by India's main centrist party, the India's National Congress, refused to allow demolition of the mosque, the BJP mobilized Hindus throughout India in political protest. The BJP's political mobilization was quite successful, especially in the short term. The political use of religious symbols touched a raw nerve in a multi-ethnic society in which religious conflict has a long history and in which stories and memories of communal hostility and suspicion are ever present. The other constant destabilizing ingredient in India's society are widespread poverty and inequality. Thus, dissatisfied groups are always available for political mobilization. When the BJP leaders succeeded in generating support for their cause, some of the mobilized followers, especially poor young men from small towns who had few resources but much anger, raged out of control. Once mobilized, these followers continued to promote the conflict. The Congress-led national government presented an ambivalent attitude towards the growing Hindu mobilization. On the one hand, the government needed to protect India's minorities and to maintain law and order, but on the other hand, it was afraid of alienating the Hindu majority group, whose electoral support was essential for winning future elections. As the national government hesitated and the BJP sustained its high level of mobilization, thousands of Hindus stormed and demolished the Islamic mosque at Ayodhya. This incident highlights three important themes in contemporary Indian politics. First, political struggles in a relatively poor democracy are especially likely to be contentious, given the multicultural nature of India. Many of these struggles readily become ethnic conflicts The lines of conflict are sometimes defined along religion, at other times along language or territorial attachment. Second, the growing contentiousness among groups is political in the sense that mobilized groups seek to influence who rules and what the rulers do. In other words, numerous mobilized groups want more of what is valued in society, namely wealth, status, and power, and expect the government to fulfill their demands. And third, although growing conflicts often push Indian politics to brink, somehow India's democracy in the nearly 50 years since independence has managed to pull back, absorbs the crisis. The model through albeit with a strained democratic system. With a population of nearly 900 million, nearly the population of all African and Latin American countries combined, India is the world's largest democracy. It is also the oldest democracy among developing countries of Asia in the late 1940s, when it emerged as a sovereign nation state following the end of British colonial rule. The durability of Indian democracy is especially intriguing considering the diversity of India's society. Some 14 major languages and numerous dialects are spoken in India. Although Hinduism is the religion of most Indians, people subscribing to nearly every one of the world's great religions, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and Judaism, live in India. Furthermore, Indian society, especially the Hindu society, is divided into a myriad of castes. Although these are mainly occupation groups, they also tend to be closed social groups in the sense that people are born into, marry, and die within their caste. Wealth and income present intense contrast in Indian society. At the top are a small number of the incredibly affluent who have made their fortunes in businesses and industries. The personal wealth of the wealthiest of these, for example, Tatas and Birlas, two of India's largest business house rivals, the wealth of business executives around the world. Below them are a much larger group, nearly 100 million Indians are relatively well off and have the same standard of living as middle classes in many developed countries. By contrast, India's lower middle classes, some 500 million Indians, are mainly small farmers or urban workers, relatively poor by global standards. They barely eke out a living, and finally, at the bottom of the class structure are about 300 million people who are extremely poor and are concentrated mostly in India's thousands of villages as landless laborers or as the urban unemployed in shabby city slums. Another aspect of India's diversity is the contrast between primitive and sophisticated technologies of production. Low levels of literacy, poverty, and primitive technology characterize a fair amount of India's rural society. At the other end of spectrum, India has a very sophisticated, technologically developed industrial sector that produces a variety of consumer products, military technologies, nuclear energy, and computers. Lastly, India's diversity is organized into a federal system of government with 22 states and several other special political units. This social, economic, and political diversity provides a challenging context within which to comprehend the functioning of Indian democracy. India is a parliamentary democracy designed on the British model. The parliament in India, known as the Lok Sabha or the House of the People, is the most significant political body. The leader of the political party with the most seats in the Lok Sabha becomes the Prime Minister, who nominates a cabinet mostly from the ranks of the other elected members to Parliament. The Prime Minister and the cabinet, along with permanent civil servants, control much of the government's daily functioning. The current government in India is formed by the Congress Party, which, except for a few important interludes, has ruled India continuously since the late 1940s. Congress governments during the 1990s have enjoyed only a very slim majority in the Lok Sabha. The main opposition party in the Lok Sabha is the right-leaning Hindu Nationalist Party, the BIP. Another significant opposition party is the left-leaning Communist Party of India, the Marxist, or the CPM. Although communist in name, it is mainly a reform-oriented party with support from peasants and workers. Both the BIP and the CPM are regionally concentrated, whereas the Congress is organized throughout the country. During the last 2 or 3 decades, some of India's essential political institutions, such as political parties, the federal system, bureaucracy, and the judiciary, have not functioned very effectively, partly because of the unavoidable democratic demands from India's diverse and mobilized political groups. However, this ineffectiveness has also resulted from the actions of India's top political leaders, who, when threatened, sought to block access that challenges may have to powerful positions. This is one reason why India's important political party, the Congress, has stopped conducting internal party elections for selecting party officers. Also, leaders below the national level, especially at the state level, have in recent years been appointed from above rather than elected from below. Those royal rather than competent have similarly been favored for appointments in the bureaucracy and the judiciary. Such developments have contributed to the growing ineffectiveness of some of India's most important political institutions, further complicating the task of governing India's complex society. With governments of precarious majorities in power, together with weakened political institutions and considerable political activism in the society, the political situation in contemporary India is not very stable. India's domestic troubles both reflect and influence its changing status in the world of states. The nation emerged from its long independent struggle against Great Britain to assume the leadership of the non-aligned bloc, a group of developing nations intent on remaining neutral in the Cold War context between the United States and the Soviet Union. India also sought economic self-sufficiency through a policy of state-led industrialization focused on meeting the needs of its large internal market. This economic strategy has had mixed results and has done little to alleviate the country's terrible poverty. As with many other developing nations, India has had to adjust its economic strategy to meet the demands of increasingly competitive and interdependent global markets. How this situation developed and where the country is headed are among the subjects discussed in this session on India. The central theme to consider is how a democratic government in India can simultaneously accommodate the demands of its diverse social groups and create a wealthy and more egalitarian society. If India succeeds in this task, it may join the East Asian examples of development success such as the Republic of Korea. However, if India fails, it could join the ranks of the more troubled cases of Africa. India's most likely future path would be to continue performing somewhere between the out-of-control success cases of East Asia on the one hand and the sad development disasters of Africa on the other hand. Critical junctures. India is among the most ancient civilizations of the world, dating back to the 3rd millennium BC. The area where the countries of Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh now exist. The Indian subcontinent has witnessed the rise and fall of many civilizations and empires, some vast, others more limited. Only the most recent legacies that have shaped the political present are reviewed here. Of these, 3 are especially significant. First is the impact of nearly 200 years of British colonial rule from the mid-18th to the mid-20th century, out of which emerged not only India's present political boundaries, but also a relatively stagnant economy and a nationalist movement committed to bringing both sovereignty and prosperity to a new nation. Second, in more recent times, is the Nehru era, approximately from 1950 to 1964, when sovereign India was ruled by Jawaharlal Nehru, during whose rule India developed both a democratic and a federal system of government and a planned economy aimed at India's industrialization. Third is the Indira Gandhi era, approximately between 1965 to 1984, when Nehru's daughter ruled India and when democratic politics became more populist and turbulent. Her left-leaning rhetoric also failed to relieve India's considerable poverty. The colonial legacy. Motivated by a combination of economic and political interests, the British started making inroads into the Indian subcontinent in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Since 1526, large section of the subcontinent has been ruled by the Mughal dynasty. The Mughals came to India originally from Central Asia and were Muslims by religion. As the power of the Mughal emperors declined in the 18th century, lesser princely contenders vied with one another for supremacy. In this environment, the British East India Company, a large English trading organization with commercial interests in India and strong backing for its ventures from the British Crown, was able to play off one Indian prince against another, forming alliances with some, subduing others, and thus managing to enhance its control by a policy of divide and rule. Growing control also enabled the British to sell their relatively cheap manufactured goods to India, with significant long-term economic consequences. Indigenous manufacturing, especially of textiles, and a whole generation of Indian artisans were ruined by the forced opening of the Indian market. This informal empire was replaced in the mid-19th century with a more formal one, after a major revolt by an alliance of Indian princes against growing British power, an incident known in Indian history as the Sepoy Rebellion or the Mutiny of 1857. The British Crown assumed the direct control of governing India. The ensuing 90-year formal British rule over India from 1857 to 1947 left important legacies for the future of Indian politics. India occupied a key place in Britain's global empire. As its largest colony, it was the jewel in the crown and of great psychological value to Britain's global ambitions. Like other colonies, India contributed to Britain's successful industrial revolution because it was a source of cheap raw materials and provided an outlet for both British manufactured goods and investment. British political control over the Indian subcontinent was also essential. It is no coincidence that India's independence from Britain in 1947 marked the beginning of the end of Britain as a major imperial world power. Colonial rule in India provided a model for subsequent British colony ventures, for example, in Nigeria. Finally, India was a strategic resource. It provided raw materials and soldiers to help Britain during both world wars. In order to consolidate its political and economic hold over India, the British entered into alliances with India's traditional ruling groups and eventually helped form a modern central government. The British created three main varieties of ruling arrangement within India. First, numerous small to medium-sized states, as many as covering an area equal to 2/5 of the subcontinent, continued to be ruled through the colonial period by traditional Indian princes, the Maharajas. In exchange for accepting British rule, these Indian princely states were allowed a relatively free hand within their realms. Second, in other parts of India, British indirect rule penetrated more deeply than in the princely states. For example, in the Bengal Presidency, currently the state of Bihar, West Bengal and Bangladesh. In these regions, the British transformed traditional Indian elites who controlled much agricultural land into legal landlords, the zamindars, in exchange for the periodic payments to the colonial administration. Third, the British established direct rule in other parts of India. For example, in Bombay and the Madras presidencies, that is, large areas around the cities of the same name, where British civil servants were directly responsible for collecting land taxes and for advocating law and order. Although the British rule in India thus took a variety of forms, it seldom reached very deep into India's society, especially rural society, which was organized into numerous relatively self-sufficient villages. Within villages, social life was further divided into religiously sanctified caste groups, with some land-owning castes dominating many other castes lower in the ritual hierarchy, occupation, and income scale. Diverse villages shared this basic organization irrespective of whether they were located in princely states, in areas controlled by zamindars, or in the areas controlled directly by civil servants. At the top of this structure was an alien, colonial rule. A semblance of coherence to this British rule in India was achieved through the creation of a central government that could impose control over these various territories. The British thus helped create an all-Indian civil service, police force, and army. Although at first, only British nationals could serve in these institutions, especially as officers, the British gradually introduced modern educational institutions to India, and some educated Indians were incorporated into these governmental services. Unlike some other colonies, especially those in Africa, the British in India helped create a relatively effective state structure. When India emerged from British rule in 1947, the new Indian state basically maintained and expanded these colonial institutions because the civil, police, and armed services in contemporary India continued to be organized along the principles established by the British colonialists in the last century. It is fair to suggest that the roots of the modern Indian state can be traced back to their colonial origin. The Indian economy during British rule remained inefficient and largely stagnant. The British did not colonize India to develop its economy. Instead, they ruled India for their own economic and political interests, with several long-term repercussions. For example, during the colonial period, the Indian economy was largely agricultural, with hundreds of millions of poor peasants living in thousands of small villages, tilling the land with primitive technology and producing at a fairly low level the society's main source of wealth, namely agricultural products. The British, along with Indian landlords, extracted extensive resources from Indian agriculture, mainly in the form of land revenues, land taxes, and tributes from Indian princes. However, they only reinvested a small portion of this surplus into improving agricultural production. Most resources were squandered through conspicuous consumption by Indian princes and landlords or used to run the expensive colonial governments. The result of this mismanagement of resources was that Indian agricultural productivity, that is, the amount of wheat, rice, or other products produced from one unit of land, mostly stagnated in the first half of the 20th century. Agricultural productivity in India was considerably lower in 1950 than in Japan or even China. Some industry developed under colonial rule, but its scope was also limited. The British wanted to sell their own manufactured goods to India in exchange for Indian raw materials, and because the British economy was more advanced, it was difficult for Indians to establish manufacturing enterprises that could compete successfully. The British did not provide any real protection to Indian industry, and in any case, most Indians were too poor to generate a substantial demand for industrial products. These factors made it difficult for Indians to enter manufacturing as viable competitors. The Indian economy at independence from Britain in 1947 was thus relatively stagnant, especially in agriculture, but also in industry. As a result, one of the central tasks facing Indian leaders since 1947 has been to stimulate the growth of this sluggish economy. With the growth of commerce, education, and urban life, groups of urban educated Indian elites, often of high caste origin, emerged as the new Indian middle classes. They both observed and closely interacted with their colonial rulers and often felt slighted by their treatment as second-class citizens next to British nationals within their own society. Some members of this new middle class attempted to reform the traditional Hindu Indian society, especially its more repugnant elements of a highly discriminatory caste system and poor treatment of women. Among these very early Hindu nationalists who believed that a reformed Hinduism could provide a basis for a new modern India, others were attracted to British liberal ideas and invoked these to seek greater equality with the British. The century of British colonial rule witnessed growing intellectual and cultural ferment in India. The British colonial rulers and traditional Indian elites had become allies of sorts, squeezing from the poor Indian peasantry resources that were simultaneously used to maintain the colonial bureaucratic state and to support the conspicuous lifestyles of a parasitic landlord class. It was not long before Indian nationalists sought to oppose this arrangement, and an opposition political movement with long-term consequences emerged, namely the Indian Nationalist Movement. The organization that represented this movement, the Indian Nationalist Congress (INC), emerged in 1885 in Bombay. Its aim was to right racial, cultural, and political wrongs of colonial rule. Over time, this organization grew from its limited elite origins to a full-blown mass nationalist movement that demanded and eventually succeeded in establishing a sovereign Indian state. Organization of the states. India is a democratic republic with a parliamentary and a federal system of government. The constitution adopted in 1950 created this system, and although there have been many profound changes since then in the distribution and the use of power, the basic character of India's political system has remained unchanged. Moreover, for much of this period, India has been a stable, democratic country with mass adult suffrage and periodic elections at all levels, both local, provincial, and national. This continuity and democratic stability are remarkable among developing countries. Note the contrast with such other countries as Brazil and Nigeria. To simplify a complex reality, the main explanation for this stability is that Indian democracy has accommodated many new power challenges while successfully repressing the most difficult ones. This highlights the fact that India's democratic institutions, though always under pressure, have achieved considerable resilience and established their authority to effectively mobilize sufficient cohesion that the most serious political threats to its integrity are contained. India's constitution is a lengthy and, in contrast to the British one, on which it is modeled, a written document that is periodically amended by legislature. Among its special features, 3 are worth noting. First, unlike many constitutions, the India Constitution directs the Indian government to promote social and economic equality and justice. The Constitution thus goes beyond stipulating formal procedures of decision-making and all allocating powers among political institutions to outlining substantial goals of politics and of the state. Although the impact of such constitutional provisions on governmental policies is limited, the provisions provide normative standards within which issues of welfare and social justice cannot be readily ignored as governmental responsibilities. Second, the Indian Constitution, similar to the US Constitution, provides for freedom of religion, thus making India a secular state. This is an especially controversial issue in contemporary Indian politics because one of the major political parties, BJP, is committed to establishing Hinduism as a state-sanctioned religion. And third, the Indian Constitution allows for the temporary suspension of many democratic rights under conditions of emergency. These provisions have been used somewhat understandably under conditions of a national security threat during wars with Pakistan or China, but more disturbingly, to deal with internal political threats. The most dramatic example of the latter was the national emergency from 1975 to 1977, when a politically vulnerable Indira Gandhi suspended many democratic rights and imprisoned her leading political opponents. India's federal system of 23 states is relatively centralized. The central government controls the most essential government functions such as defense, foreign policy, taxation, and public expenditures and economic planning, especially industrial planning. State governments, by no means powerless, formally control such policy areas as agriculture, education, and law and order within the states. Because they are heavily dependent on the central government for funds in these policy areas, however, the power of the states is limited. The main institutions comprising India's central states are a president, a prime minister, a cabinet, 2 houses of parliament, and a permanent bureaucracy. The office of the president is largely ceremonial. By contrast, the prime minister is the linchpin of the system because effective power is concentrated in that office, where most of the country's important policies originate. In periodic national elections, 544 members of the Lok Sabha, the lower house of the bicameral parliament, are elected. Lok Sabha is much more politically significant than the Rajya Sabha, the upper house. The leader of the party with a majority, or in some circumstances with the largest number of seats in the Lok Sabha, usually becomes the prime minister. Even though the Prime Minister is formally appointed by the President, the Prime Minister governs with the help of the Cabinet, which periodically meets to discuss important issues, including any new legislation that is likely to be initiated. Individually, these Cabinet members are the heads of various ministries, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Industry, that direct the daily work of the government and make up the permanent bureaucracy. The Executive. The President is elected indirectly by an electoral college, using a complex formula that ultimately involves elected representatives from both the national and state governments. In most circumstances, the President acts on the advice of the Prime Minister and is thus not a very powerful political figure in India. The Presidency is a ceremonial office symbolizing the unity of the country and supposedly above partisan politics. Under exceptional circumstances, however, especially when the selection of a Prime Minister becomes a complex issue, the President can play an important political role. For example, in the early 1990s, when no party had a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, the President had to decide whether to call new elections or to let the party with the most seats try to form a government. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet are the most powerful political figures in India. Because they represent the majority party in Parliament, the passage of a bill is not always as complicated process as it can be in a presidential system, especially one with a divided government. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet also head various ministries, so that after legislation is passed, they oversee its implementation. In practice, the permanent bureaucracy, especially the senior and the middle level bureaucrats, are truly responsible for policy implementation. Nevertheless, as in most parliamentary systems, such as those in Britain, Germany and Japan, there is considerable overlap in India between the executive and the legislative branches of the government, creating a greater degree of centralization of power than at first seems evident. The issue of who will become the Prime Minister has been a rather dramatic and infrequent issue in India's political life. Between 1950 and 1984, except for a new brief interludes, India had had only two Prime Ministers, Nehru and Indira Gandhi. This is nearly unique among democracies. It underlines the powerful hold that the Nehru-Gandhi family had on India's political imagination, including the imagination of poor, illiterate Indians. Since then, however, India has had a more rapid turnover in prime ministers. 4 different leaders have ruled India since 1984. Rajiv Gandhi, Indira Gandhi's son, succeeded his mother after her assassination in 1984. When he lost power 4 years later, there were 2 attempts to form non-Congress governments under the leadership of VP Singh and Chandrasekhar, respectively. Factionalism within the loose coalitions that comprise these non-Congress governments, however, curtailed these attempts. As Rajiv Gandhi campaigned in a bid to return to power, he too was assassinated. Subsequently, the Congress party did win elections and again returned power in 1990 with Narasimha Rao as Prime Minister. The method of selecting a Prime Minister in India is fairly complex. The original choice of Nehru was a natural one, given his prominent position in the nationalist movement. The choice of Indira Gandhi was less obvious. She was chosen to head the Congress party by a group of prominent second-tier party leaders. Her choice reflected several considerations, the most important of which was her national name recognition and its ability to attract the popular vote. Although the process of passing power from a father to a daughter may appear rather feudal, which to some extent it is, there is valid electoral rationality for such a choice in India. A similar logic prevailed when Rajiv Gandhi was chosen by party elites to succeed his mother. The underlying logic was especially powerful. Rajiv Gandhi inherited all the political sympathy generated by his mother's assassination. His leadership enabled the Congress party to return to power in 1984 with a handsome electoral majority. Following Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, Nehru Gandhi's family line had reached a natural end. Rajiv Gandhi was married to an Italian, Sonia Gandhi, and their children at the time were in college, too young to enter politics. the Congress party was desperate enough that it attempted unsuccessfully to recruit Sonia Gandhi as its leader. Given the importance of the Nehru Gandhi family in Indian politics, however, the eventual reemergence of Sonia Gandhi or of her children as leaders cannot be ruled out. The choice of Narasimha Rao was unusual, for he was about to retire from active politics. He was brought back as an elder statesman, non-threatening and acceptable to competing factions within Congress. Narasimha Rao is the first prime minister from the south of India. All the previous heads of states have been from the north. In fact, but for one exception, they all had their political base in the most populous north-central, poor but politically significant state of Uttar Pradesh. After the leader of the ruling party, and thus the prime minister, has been selected, he or she chooses the cabinet, mostly from among the party's elected members to parliament. Seniority, competence, and personal loyalty are the top criteria that any prime minister takes into account when choosing the cabinet ministers. Regional and caste representation at the highest level of the government must also be considered in forming a government. During Indira Gandhi's rule, personal loyalty was critical in the choice of senior ministers. Rajiv Gandhi, by contrast, put a high premium on competence, which unfortunately he equated with youth and technical skills at the expense of political experience. Narasimha Rao, an experienced politician, has put together an eclectic cabinet with a narrow power base. He is less free than his predecessors to select a personally loyal cabinet. Rather, he has need to include all those with power in one region or another of India, while taking into account issues of competence and caste balance, as well as ensuring that potential challengers are either co-opted or kept at bay. Bureaucracy. The Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers run the government in close collaboration with senior civil servants. Each senior minister oversees what is often a sprawling bureaucracy, staffed by some very competent overworked senior civil servants, and by many not so competent underworked lowly bureaucrats, well known for their long tea breaks while they stare at months of unopened files. Because political leaders come and go, whereas senior civil servants stay, many civil servants possess a storehouse of knowledge and expertise that makes them very powerful. The higher level civil servants in India reach their position after considerable experience within the government. They enter the service, formerly known as the Indian Administrative System (IAS), at a relatively young age, usually in their early 20s, by passing a highly competitive general exam. Some of India's most talented young men and women were attracted to the IAS during the 1950s and the 1960s, underlining the prestige that service in national government used to enjoy in Indian society. This attraction of the IAS has declined, however, and many talented young people now also go into engineering or business administration, or if possible, leave the country for better opportunities abroad. Government services have become tainted as arenas of corruption have developed, and the level of professionalism within the IAS has eroded, mainly because politicians prefer the criteria of loyalty over merit and seniority in promotions. Nevertheless, the IAS continues to recruit very talented young people, many of whom mature into dedicated senior civil servants and who still constitute the backbone of the Indian government. The IAS produces India's elite bureaucrats, those who occupy a critical but relatively thin layer at the top of India's sprawling bureaucracy. The competence of these elite bureaucrats is a central reason why India is moderately well governed. Below the IAS, unfortunately, the level of talent and professionalism drops rather sharply. Within each ministry at the national level and in many parallel substructures at the state level, the bureaucracy in India is infamous for corruption and inefficiency. These problems contribute to the gap that existed in India between good policies made at the top and their poor implementation at the local level. Military and police. The Indian military, with more than 1 million well-trained and armed men, is a highly professional organization that enjoys the respect of Indian society. Unlike the militaries in many other developing countries, say Brazil and Nigeria, the Indian military has never intervened directly in politics. This has as much or more to do with the fact that India has a relatively well-functioning democracy, and it has to do with the character of the Indian military. Over the years, however, the continuity of constitutional electoral politics and a relatively apolitical military have come to reinforce and strengthen each other. Civilian politicians provide ample resources to the armed forces and for the most part let them function as a professional organization. The armed forces in turn obey the orders of democratically elected leaders, and although they lobby to preserve their own interests, for the most part they stay out of the normal tumble of democratic politics. Since the 1980s, two factors have weakened this well-institutionalized separation of politics and military. First, during Indira Gandhi's rule, political agreements with and loyalty to political leaders became criteria for securing top military jobs. This policy tends to politicize the military and narrow the separation between politics and military. The second factor is the growing political problems within India, especially regional and ethnic demands for secession. As these demands became more intense in some states, notably the Punjab and Kashmir, and as those making the demands armed themselves, occasionally with the help of India's hostile neighbor Pakistan, the Indian government called in the armed forces. However, soldiers are not trained to resolve political problems. Rather, they are trained to use armed coercion to force compliance from reluctant political actors. As a result, not only have democratic norms and human rights been violated within India, but the distance between politics and the military has further narrowed. A similar trend towards politicization and deprofessionalization has occurred in India's sprawling police services, but with a difference. The India Police Organization was never as professionalized as the India Armed Forces, and the police services in India come under the jurisdiction not of the central government but of various state governments. Because state governments are generally less well run than the national governments, the cumulative impact is that the Indian police are no longer apolitical civil servants. State-level politicians regularly interfere in policy, personnel issues, and police officers in turn regularly oblige politicians who help them. The problem is especially serious at lower levels, where police officials interact with members of society. The image of average police officer in most of India is not positive. The police are rightly viewed as easily bribed and often aligned with criminals or politicians. In some states, such as Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, police often take sides in local conflicts instead of acting as neutral arbiters or enforcers of laws. Thus, they tilt the power balance in favor of such dominant social groups as landowners or upper caste or the majority religious community, the Hindus. Between the regular armed forces and the state-level police forces, there are paramilitary forces of nearly 500,000 men. These troops are organized under various names and are controlled by the national government. As India politics has become more turbulent over the last 2 decades, these paramilitary forces have steadily increased. The expansion reflects the Indian government's growing concern over maintaining internal law and order. But because the national government calls on the regular armed forces only as a last resort in the management of internal conflicts, and because the state-level police forces are not very reliable, these paramilitary forces are viewed as a way to maintain order, albeit a very expensive solution. A large, sprawling and relatively ineffective police service continues to remain a problematic presence in Indian society. Also, as terrorists or freedom fighters have become better armed, especially in Kashmir, paramilitary forces have proven inadequate to contain them. Judiciary. An independent judiciary is another component of India's state system. The main institution is the Supreme Court, comprised of a Chief Justice and 17 other judges, nominally appointed by the President, but as in most matters of political significance in India, only on the advice of the Prime Minister. Once appointed, the judges cannot be removed from the bench until retirement at age 65. The caseload on the Supreme Court, as on much of the Indian legal system, is extremely heavy, with a significant backlog. The main political role of the Supreme Court is to ensure that legislation conforms to the intent of the Constitution, because the Indian Constitution is very detailed. The need for interpretation is not as great as in many other countries. Nevertheless, there are real conflicts both within the Constitution and in India's political landscape that often need to be adjudicated by the Supreme Court. For example, the Constitution protects private property but also urges the government to pursue social justice. Indian leaders have often promulgated socialist legislation, such as requiring the redistribution of agricultural land. Legislation of this nature is necessarily considered by the Supreme Court because it potentially violates the right to private property. Many Supreme Court cases have involved the conflict between socialistically inclined legislature and basic constitutional rights. Cases involving other politically significant issues, for instance, rights of bonded labor, rights of religious minorities such as Muslims, and rights of women in society, also periodically reach the Supreme Court for decisions. Like many other Indian political institutions, the Supreme Court has lost much of its autonomy over the last 2 decades. The process began during Indira Gandhi's rule, when she argued that the court was too conservative and an obstacle to her socialist program. To remedy this shortcoming, she appointed many pliant judges, including a Chief Justice. The Supreme Court itself more or less succumbed to her wishes during the critical 2 years of emergency, when the political and civil rights of many Indians were violated. Unfortunately, this episode cost the Supreme Court considerable prestige as a neutral arbiter in India's state system. No such dramatic instance of a politicized Supreme Court has been recorded since the late 1970s. Nevertheless, India's highest court, although still a political institution of some significance, is by no means as independent an institution as the founders of India's state system may have intended, and as it was in the first decades following independence. Policy making process. Major policies in India are made at the highest level of the government, in New Delhi, the nation's capital. As mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister and the senior cabinet ministers are generally responsible for initiating new policies and related legislation. Behind the scenes, senior civil servants in each ministry, as well as in each such specific cross-ministry offices, as the Prime Minister's Secretariat or the Planning Commission, play a critical role in identifying problems, synthesizing available data, and presenting alternate solutions and their various implications to political leaders. After decisions have been made at the highest level, many of them require new legislation, with the Prime Minister dependent on a majority in the Parliament to remain Prime Minister. Passage of most legislation through the Parliament is not a significant political obstacle in India, except in extremely controversial areas. Rather, the real policy drama in India occurs both during the early process, when major bills are under consideration, and then during the process of implementation. To fully understand these processes, how interests get organized and find representations needs to be explained. Examples of several specific policies will help clarify these issues. First, let us take the example of economic liberalization policies. These policies represent a major economic change, and they are decided at the highest level of government, involving only a handful of senior ministers and bureaucrats. To reach these decisions, however, a fairly complex set of political activities unfold. For example, the decision makers need to consult some of the most important interest groups, such as associations of Indian businessmen or representative of such critical multinational organizations as the World Bank or the IMF. Others, including those who may be adversely affected, need to be heard. Organized labor, for example, may call a one-day general strike, as they usually did, to warn the government that any attempt to privatize the public sector will meet considerable resistance. Newspapers, magazines, and as intellectuals also express their support or opposition publicly. Sooner or later, political parties get into the act. Members of the ruling party, the Congress in this case, do not necessarily support the political thinking of their own leaders at the early stage. Rather, they worry about the political implications of policies, both for intra-party power struggles but especially for future elections. Opposition parties in turn worry about the interests of their constituencies and adopt a more or less principled stand towards the new policies under consideration that is for, against, or somewhere in between. All of these pulls and pushes modify the policy that the government eventually adopts. After policies have been adopted, their implementation is far from assured. Again, continuing with the liberalization example, some aspects of the new policy package have proven easier to implement than others. Changing the exchange rate, that is the value of India's rupee in relation to such currencies as the US dollar, is relatively easy to implement because both the policy decision and its implementation requires the actions of only a handful of political and bureaucratic elites. By contrast, the attempts to simplify the procedures for India or foreign businesses executives to create new business enterprises has proven more complicated. Implementation of such policies involves layers of bureaucrats, most of whom at one time benefited from the control they exercise over businessmen. Now forced to relinquish this control, many of them drag their feet and, where possible, sabotage the newly simplified procedures. Another example concerns policies aimed at improving the standard of living for the Indian poor. It outlines a related but different set of issues in the policy-making process, especially in the implementation process. For a few decades, the national government has accepted redistribution of agricultural land and provision of public works programs as two policies that may help India's rural poor. The main role of the national government has been to set broad outlines for land reforms and to allocate funds for public work programs. As both of these measures primarily influences rural and agricultural life, and because agricultural issues in India tend to be under the jurisdiction of state governments, a further refinement of these policies as well as their implementation was left to the states. However, state governments vary both in terms of the class coalitions and political parties that rule within them, as well as in terms of quality of their bureaucracies. The result is that the implementation of anti-poverty policies within India has been quite uneven. Land redistribution involves taking land from well-off and powerful landlords and redistributing it to poor tenants or agricultural laborers. This is a highly controversial process, requiring some combination of forceful actions by state governments and the organization of the poor beneficiaries. Generally, attempts at land redistribution have been relatively unsuccessful in most Indian states because the interests of land-owning classes are well represented and state-level bureaucrats often have close links to these land-owning groups. Partial exceptions to these trends are found in the state of Kerala and West Bengal, where communist state governments and well-organized poor have made some progress in land reforms. Attempts to generate extra employment for the rural poor through public work projects such as road construction and canal cleaning have been somewhat more successful than land distribution policies because they do not involve any direct confiscation of property. The main issues in the implementation of these policies are the quality of project chosen and how honestly they are completed. This in turn draws attention to the quality of local governments in implementing policies initiated at the national level. Because this quality varies, though rarely is it very high, considerably resources assigned to poverty alleviation, programs are wasted. Nevertheless, the policies have been effectively implemented in the states of Maharashtra and West Bengal, where there is considerable political pressure from caste or class politics, and in some southern states where the quality of local bureaucracy is somewhat better. Local government. Under its federal system, the balance of power between the central and state government in India varies according to time and place. In general, the more popular the central government and the prime minister, the more the states feel obligated to the center. During Nehru's and especially during Indira Gandhi's rule, The states were often quite constrained. By contrast, a weaker government at the center, as for example the Congress government that took office in 1991, enhances the room for state governments to maneuver. When state governments are run by political parties other than the national ruling party, and this is often true in contemporary India, there is considerable scope for center-state conflicts. For example, a popular communist government in West Bengal has in recent years often disagreed with the national government in New Delhi, charging it with discriminatory treatment in the allocation of finances and other centrally controlled resources. The formal structure of the state government parallels that of the national government. The chief minister of each state heads the state government. The office of the chief minister of a state thus parallels the office of the prime minister nationally. The chief minister is the leader of the majority party or the party with most seats in the lower house of the state legislature. As the prime minister does, the chief minister appoints a cabinet, and these ministers in turn head various ministries staffed by a state level, permanent bureaucracy. In lieu of a president, each state has a governor appointed by the national president. The governors, like the president, are supposed to serve on the advice of the chief ministers, but in practice they often become politically powerful, especially in states where the national government is at odds with the state governments or where state governments are unstable. The governors can dismiss elected state governments and proclaim temporary presidential rule if they determine state governments to be ineffective. When this happens, the elected government is dissolved and the state is governed from New Delhi until fresh elections are called and a new government is elected. Although intended to be a sensible constitutional option, this provision is unfortunately often used by an intrusive national government to achieve political ends in one state or another. For example, following the Ayodhya incident that was described in Section 1, the Supreme Court ruled that the BJP had acted illegally, a decision that allowed Narasimha Rao to dismiss 4 state governments governed by the BJP. When new elections were held in these 4 states in November 1993, the BJP returned to power in only one of the 4 states, contributing to long-term acrimony between the BJP and the Congress. The power struggle between the central government and the states is an ongoing one, with many Indian states inhabited by people who share different histories and cultures, including language, and with political parties in power at the center that differ from those in the states. The center-state conflict becomes multidimensional, couched in the rhetoric of relative jurisdiction, but fueled by substantial political and ethnic conflicts. Although this issue will be discussed in the next session, we should note here that despite the formal division of power between the center and the states, India's central government is really quite powerful. Below state governments are district, city and village governments. Given India's size, it is not surprising that the specific forms, quality of personnel and effectiveness of these local governments greatly varies. Usually, however, most local governments have both elected and bureaucratic personnel. None of these sub-governments are policy-making bodies. Instead, policy is made at the national and state levels, with this lower level responsible for implementation. Thus, considerable resources pass through these institutions, and even though local governments seldom enjoy formal discretion over how these resources are allocated, there is ample room for misuse. Local political elites, bureaucrats and other local big men often collude as they decide the location of projects, who gets the contracts, or who gets jobs on public projects, all the time ensuring themselves a healthy share of the public money. This is why many local governments in India tend to be corrupt and ineffective. There are some exceptions to this abuse. For example, in the state of West Bengal, a reform-oriented leftist government has helped improve the functioning of local governments, but for the most part, local government in India languish and waste resources. As a result, city streets are not kept clean, potholes on paved streets do not get filled, irrigation canals in villages do not get desalted, tube wells are located in the backyards of the village, big men, and rural schools are so poorly built that they leak as soon as the monsoon starts. Study session summary. In this study session, a simple but important fact needs to be reiterated. By the year 2015 or so, India will be the largest country in the world, surpassing China in total population. How such a country is governed will remain an issue of considerable significance, not only for the large segment of humanity that resides within India's boundaries, but also for India's neighbors and for other concerned citizens worldwide. A democratic and prosperous India could be an enormously stabilizing force. By contrast, a nationalist and angry India, poor but powerfully armed, could not be considered a positive development. Similarly, a turbulent India, driven by ethnic and class turmoil and with a collapsing authority structure, will have profound negative consequences not just for Indians but globally. We noted that policy-making process in India, though relatively centralized, takes into account various interests and frequently produces well-developed policies. By contrast, the process of implementation is quite decentralized and relatively ineffective. End of study session 7. Thank you for listening.